Welcome back. In this section, we're going to explore gender outside of the ideas of just man and woman. As I mentioned before, the term for people whose gender matches their biological sex is cisgender. Cis meaning on the same side. The majority of people are cisgender. However, for some people, their gender does not match their biological sex. The term for anyone who feels this way is transgender. This is a very broad category and includes anyone whose gender identity or gender expression exists outside the boundaries of what is considered appropriate for someone of their biological sex. This is most commonly shortened to trans. Let's talk about a few common ways trans people label themselves. As a caveat, though, I want to be clear that this is language that is evolving rapidly. The trans community has only recently been able to start finding language for ourselves, as opposed to using terms developed by others, particularly those in the medical community. Because this language hasn't really existed before, right now it's undergoing a lot of shifts as people find better ways to describe the internal feelings that have already existed. The labels and definitions we use today may not be the best ones to use in a few years, but these are the best terms we have now. When we think of trans people, most people think of binary trans people, a woman that was born male, or a man that was born female. These are people who were socialized in one binary gender role, and who have moved to the other binary gender role. Non-binary people are trans people who do not feel they are either a man or a woman, but have a gender that exists in between or outside of the two-gender system. Agender people are trans people who do not have a gender, or have a gender identity that is neutral. Trans people who describe themselves as gender expansive or gender nonconforming are those whose gender expression is more than what is societally acceptable for men and women. This term is specifically about gender expression, that is, how you choose to present yourself. Gender expansive people's gender identity might be cis, binary trans, non-binary, or agender. Finally, two-spirit is a term specifically referred to the gender experience of Native Americans who are LGBTQ+. Because many Native cultures view gender and sexuality different than European and European origin countries, it's difficult to map our labels for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and trans people onto their concepts. Two-spirit is something of an encompassing term for those who are not cisgender and not heterosexual, but also may refer to different roles that a two-spirit person plays within Native cultures that do not have an analog in European origin cultures. In fact, many non-European cultures have some sort of concept of a gender or genders that exist outside the binary, or man and woman. And those people who are not strictly men or women have a role to play within their cultures. Shown here is a map where non-binary gender roles of some sort have been documented. As you can see, many different cultures around the world have created a space for trans people within their culture. This speaks to how universal and natural the internal trans experience is. Trans people are a part of the range of human experience. I've included the link to this map here, which will also be available in the lecture notes online if you want to just click on it, if you'd like to explore the different cultures for yourself. There are a few other identities that relate to the transgender umbrella, but are not strictly speaking part of the trans community. The first of these is the crossdresser. This is a cisgender person who dresses in clothing of the opposite binary gender. While this is usually stigmatized for being done for sexual gratification, more often, it's done for emotional comfort. Some trans people may spend a period of their lives as crossdressers, as they explore their gender identity. But someone who crossdresses is not necessarily trans. In fact, they are most likely to be cisgender and heterosexual. Drag queens and drag kings are similar. These are people who crossdress specifically as a form of performance. They usually do not seek to be a true impersonation of women or men, but rather an exaggeration of femininity and masculinity. Again, some trans people may spend time as part of a drag community as they explore their gender identity. But being a drag performer did not necessarily mean that person is trans, nor does it necessarily mean that person is LGBT, although most drag performers are. There are a few concepts related to the idea of trans identity that should be defined as well. First, there's gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is the feeling that your internal gender does not match your outward gender expression. This might include dysphoria around your social role, your outwardly expressed gender, or your physical body. Most trans people feel some sort of gender dysphoria, but it's not a requirement of being trans. Assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth, also known as AMAB and AFAB. These are terms that are used to describe the biological sex assigned to a person at birth, and the gender role they were expected to take up. These are used as a way to talk about early gendered expectations without saying one was born a boy or a girl. Many trans people feel their internal gender identity was always at odds with their biological sex, and thus were never really boys or girls. Some people may also discover that their biological sex was not clearly male or female, and that there is some form of intersex that was not apparent when a doctor glanced at their genitals when they were born. Finally, transitioning. This is the process of moving from the gender one is expected to be to the gender expression that expresses a person's internal gender identity. Most trans people transition socially in some way. They may change their name, pronouns, clothing and hair, and what gendered spaces they enter, such as bathrooms and locker rooms. Social transition is all about how one interacts in society. Medically transitioning is using hormonal or surgical interventions to change one's body. This is not something all trans people choose to do or are able to do. Some may have medical conditions that make it impossible to use medical interventions. Others do not feel medical interventions are safe. Some cannot afford medical interventions, and still others do not find the medical interventions necessary. I'd like to spend a minute here describing what hormonal interventions can and cannot do, because there are a lot of misconceptions about this, even in the trans community. For AMAB adults, taking estrogen and progesterone will cause the skin to soften, for body hair to grow thinner, for body fat to redistribute into a more female pattern, particularly in the hips and rear, and for breasts to grow. Hormones will not remove body hair altogether, though. Doing that usually requires many hours of electrolysis. Hormones will not raise an AMAB person's voice, change their facial bone structure, or change the configuration of their genitals. For those things, a surgical intervention is needed, most of which is not covered by health insurance. For AFAB adults, testosterone will cause the voice to drop, body and facial hair to grow, body fat to reconfigure to primarily the abdominal area, facial musculature to shift somewhat, and muscular strength and density overall to increase somewhat. It will not increase height, hand or foot size, or otherwise alter the bone structure, such as in the hips or face. It will also not remove breasts, nor change genital configuration. For that, surgical intervention is needed, and is often not covered by health insurance. Pronouns are one of the most common changes with social transition. She, her, hers is associated with feminine people, and he, him, his is associated with masculine people. Folks who do not feel like they fit the gender binary will often use they, them, theirs as an alternative. Others have found different pronoun combinations that work for them, such as ze, here, hers. It's as important to respect someone's pronouns as it is to respect someone's name. It's an expression of their individual self, and choosing not to use the proper pronouns is often deeply hurtful. I also wanted to go over a few outdated terms that you may come across. Because language is evolving so rapidly, it's not uncommon to see these terms in media that hasn't been updated recently. It's good to know what these terms mean, but also to know that some people might be offended if you use them. Transsexual is an outdated medicalized term for a trans person that seeks medical intervention as part of their transition. It is largely no longer used because it conflates sex and gender, puts an emphasis on medical interventions, and is a label created by the medical community rather than the trans community. Transvestite is an outdated medicalized term for crossdressers. It's been abandoned because there is a strong connotation between this term and crossdressing for sexual gratification, which is really not the most common reason for crossdressing, the most common reason being emotional comfort. FTM or MTF, which would be female to male or male to female. These are older terms for describing AFAB or AMAB folks. They've been abandoned because they emphasize moving from one binary gender to another, and for assuming gender identity isn't an internal innate identity. Finally, gender identity disorder. In previous versions of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the Handbook for Mental Health Professionals, the diagnosis for trans people was gender identity disorder. In the most recent version of the DSM, released in 2013, the diagnosis was changed to gender dysphoria. This reflected the change in understanding that gender dysphoria is a part of the human condition, rather than a mental disorder that can be cured. There was a debate over removing the diagnosis altogether, but for the time being it has been left in, so there's a code for medical insurance. Lastly, I want to explore the types of oppression that trans people experience. Transphobia is the discomfort, fear, or hatred of people outside the cisgender experience. This can vary in degree from benevolent transphobia, such as, "I'd never guess you were trans," to discrimination in housing and employment, to outright violence targeting trans people. As we know from our discussions of intersecting identities, the more marginalized identities one has, the more likely one is to experience oppression. It should come as no surprise, then, that it is Black trans women who are most likely to experience violence directed at them, and are the most likely to be killed for being trans. Cissexism is the belief that having your gender match your sex is the only normal way to exist. This belief might be consciously or unconsciously held. An example of cissexism is asking whether a baby is a boy or a girl. That information will be based only on the infant's genitals, and likely include no information on other markers of sex, nor any idea of the child's internal sense of gender. Cisnormativity is the assumption that everyone is cisgender, and the structures built in society based on that notion. Examples of cissexism might include only having M and F markers on driver's licenses, and not having a documented process of changing that identifier. Many dating sites reflect cisnormativity, because they often only give you the options of choosing male or female, and only being attracted to men or women. Gendered bathrooms and toys are other examples of cisnormativity. Finally, there is a specific strain of feminism known as trans-exclusionary radical feminism. It is a fringe theory of feminism, which is why it is labeled as radical, that specifically insists that trans women are not women, and trans men are not men. They argue that biology and early socialization are the primary markers of sex and gender, and do not accept the concepts of internal gender identity. People who hold these beliefs are often referred to as TERFs, and argue that trans people are a danger to a gendered society, particularly for women. TERFs are dismissed by most feminists, however. So, people have been trying to create graphical representations of this idea that identities related to sex and gender aren't binaries, but are spectrums. As with language, they've been evolving as we understand more about gender and sex-related identities, and as our language for those identities has grown. So this one is an early attempt. You can see here it tries to differentiate biological sex from gender identity and expression. It also attempts to show sexual orientation as a spectrum, and separate the identity of sexual orientation from actual sexual behavior. It's a good start for trying to identify the different related identities and the spectrum those identities might show up as, but it doesn't allow a lot of room for the variety of trans expression, and conflating bisexuality and asexuality is a problem. We'll talk more about sexuality next week. The genderbread person is pretty famous as the first attempt to really show how these different identities relate to an actual human. Gender identity is how you feel internally. Gender expression is how you show your gender externally. Orientation is who you love, or more specifically, who you're attracted to. And sex is your body, most commonly determined by genitals. A note, to be fair to the creators of the genderbread person, this is not the most recent version. It is the most well-known version, though, and reflects how ideas have been evolving. This is an improvement over the previous chart, mostly because it makes it plainer what each identity means for a person. It still doesn't offer a lot of space for people who are agender or asexual, or allow for the wide variation of gender identities or expressions. Finally, there's the gender unicorn. This is the only graphical representation created by trans people. Here you can see that there are multiple sliders for each aspect of identity, except for sex. That's because rather than referring to biological sex, it refers to the sex assigned at birth, at a fixed point in time. That's in part because our understanding of biological sex has changed to include more than just genitals examined at birth, and because many people do not know for certain some of the other aspects of biological sex, such as DNA and hormone levels. For the other identities, the sliders are a great way to get to the wide range of gender identities and expressions, and types of attraction we feel for others. I found some cisgender people really struggle with this wide range, so I'm going to try and break it down for you. Under a gender identity, we have sliders for female woman girl, male man boy, and other genders. A cisgender woman would probably move the top slider all the way to the right to indicate a strong gender identity of woman. An agender person might leave all the sliders to the left because they do not strongly feel like any of the genders. A two-spirit person might move the third slider to the right, indicating they most strongly feel like neither male nor female, but some other gender. But you can have any combination of these. A cisgender man might move the middle slider all the way to the right because he feels pretty strongly that he's a man, but he might also move the top slider a bit to indicate that some of his internal feeling matches up with what is considered feminine. This works the same way for gender expression. Someone who's dressing in a way we would describe as girly would slide the top slider all the way to the right. Someone who might dress very girly one day and very masculine the next might slide both the feminine and masculine sliders. Some people prefer to dress in a way that is not strictly masculine or feminine and might use the last slider more. Physical and emotional attraction work much the same way. You might find men's bodies particularly attractive most of the time, but are also attracted to people who are not men or women. But also, who you are attracted to physically may not be who you connect with emotionally, and that includes friendships. You might be a cisgender woman who is attracted to men's bodies, but most of your emotional connections are with other women. You might be a trans person that is attracted to women's bodies, but only connects emotionally with people who are not men or women. There's also a missing category here, romantic attraction. It is possible to be romantically attracted to someone, to feel warm and tender towards a person, but not have a physical attraction to them, and not have a strong emotional connection outside of romance. We'll dig into the ideas of attraction next week when we talk about sexuality.